Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Scrutiny Committee for Children and Families. The minutes of the meeting held on the 5th of June 2017. Were there any issues raised in relation to those meeting minutes? Has everyone received them? Okay. Any issues at all in any of the pages? Do you have a copy of those? Oh, right. So going through page 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. Pardon? Yes, proposed and seconded. Thank you. I'll sign those off. Okay, thank you. In terms of question time, we've received a question from Sue Whiting under Standard Order 35. Sue, would you like to come to the reserved chair, please? So everyone should have a copy of the question from Sue. I'm not going to read that out. It can be taken as read. I'd like to remind members that no discussion is to be held on the question. Sue, would you like to ask any supplementary questions? You can ask one supplementary question.
Yes, I would like to. The answer doesn't make it clear if parents are going to be invited to these workshops. And although it does mention about sensory approaches and resources, it doesn't say whether children would be included in those targeted resource showcase demonstrations.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure whether that's one supplementary question or two, but in any event, who would like to answer that from the officers, please?
We'll need to seek further clarity around whether or not on both questions, actually. So we can seek clarity on whether or not parents are invited to those workshops. And just to clarify your second point, you were asking about whether children were invited to the surgery slots.
No, it mentions that there will be a showcase demonstration of some multisensory approaches and resources for use at targeted levels for pupils who require extra support. Usually to demonstrate those, you do actually need the children there, but it doesn't make it clear.
So, Jane, are you going to follow up on that, and what kind of time frame?
We can get back to you this week with a response.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mrs. Whitting. Thank you for attending today. So moving on to item number 3, questions asked by members under Standing Orders 7.3 and 7.5. I've received no questions from members on that. Moving to item number 4, which is to advise of any other items which the Chairman's decided to take as urgent elsewhere on the agenda. And again, I haven't been notified of any urgent items. Moving on to item 5, declarations of interest in respect of items on the agenda. Do any members have any interest that they wish to declare at this point, please? Yes, Mrs. Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Just to let members know that I have a step-grandson who's subject to care services in Leicester City, and some of them might overlap with some of the agenda items we have today.
Thank you, that's noted. Anybody else? Any other interest to declare? Okay, thank you. Moving on to item number 6, declarations of the party whip in accordance with overview and scrutiny procedure rule 16. Do any members have any declarations under that? No? Okay. And presentation of petitions under Standing Order 36. There are no petitions. So we now move on to the substantive agenda in terms of item number 8, the funding requirements to deliver the Ofsted CIP Continuous Improvement Plan. It's on page 11 to 38 of your agenda pack. I'm now going to ask Paul Meredith, Director of Children and Family Services, to present that report, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Members will remember that in December 2016 we had an inspection by Ofsted under the single inspection framework. This was a major inspection, the first one for a number of years that had occurred here, went on over 4 weeks. It involved a large number of inspectors and looked at all aspects of our work in children's social care services. On the back of that, they produced a report. We were classed as requires improvement, and in their report they identified 17 areas for us to improve our services. On the back of that work, we then produced a report which we actually presented to Cabinet, and I believe came to this meeting as well, and we presented to Cabinet in March 2017, identifying actions that we needed to take in order to meet the 17 recommendations that were included in the Ofsted report. We had to send that action plan into Ofsted. That is a requirement of the inspection that we actually do that. They don't monitor us on the action plan, but they want to see a copy of it to assure themselves that the council is hearing the key messages that are in the inspection and are taking those seriously and putting specific actions in place to address those issues. Clearly, when we're inspected later on by Ofsted, they will return at various times. The most pressing one that we have at present is an inspection on our SEND services, and there will be some overlap between that and some of the work that they picked up in their single inspection framework assessment inspection. And so they will be checking there as well in terms of the progress that we're actually making. We have annual meetings with Ofsted as well, where they're also checking on progress with us as where we are. So it is a significant amount of change that we need to make in order to move the department towards good, and we recognise that in the action plan. So this report today outlines the progress that we've made on that action plan, and that's covered in Annex B and in a shortened form in terms of Annex A. The second element of the report relates to the investment that we deem is necessary in terms of us meeting all of the 17 recommendations in the report. In your report, these are detailed in Annex C, and there is an overview on page 15 of your report. So the full details and rationale for the investment fall into the following broad areas. One is achieving manageable caseloads, and I'll remind members that this did feature very heavily in the Ofsted report, that in certain areas our caseloads were too high. Linked to that, it was providing sufficient management oversight to our work, and there were seen to be clear deficiencies in that area. In certain areas of our work, we weren't meeting statutory requirements. Generally, the other element is about assuring good practice standards in terms of meeting safe practice, supporting staff to develop professionally in their time with us, and meeting legal cost pressures, which have significantly raised over the last 6 or 7 years, with care proceedings increasing from 68 per year in 2010 up to 131 last year, and so far this year we have 63 in proceedings. That's not unique to Leicestershire. That's a factor that's occurring all over the country. And the final element of the proposal is to promote the development of interagency partnership working, which I think was also recognised in the Ofsted report as being inadequate here and not up to the required standard. So all of those investments are detailed in Annex C. We believe that if we make those investments over the forthcoming year, that will both address the shortcomings identified in the Ofsted report and put the department and the council in a good position to move its services on to achieving a good standard. So I'm going to stop there because I appreciate there's lots and lots of detail in the report, and I'm sure members will want to ask lots of questions.
I'm sure they will. Obviously, this is a significant investment that we're looking at here. I think, Mr. Sheehan, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Chair. It is a significant investment and it is most welcome indeed. I do recall at a previous scrutiny meeting, in fact, when we first had a look at this report from Ofsted, we did ask quite pointedly, will the recommendations from Ofsted be fully funded? So my first question will be, are you now proposing that these recommendations are fully funded through this investment? Can you clarify that? Have you arrived at what you believe to be the correct caseload, which I think is a very important consideration here? And also, there's a statement on page 12, paragraph 12, that experience from elsewhere shows that there are significant financial risks from not investing. Now, whilst I would agree with that, I think it's only fair to see if there's any evidence to back that up. And if you've got any, I'd be pleased to hear from you. Thank you.
Mr. Meredith, do you want to take those questions now? They were in three parts, so if you'd like to cover them, please.
Hopefully I can remember all three, but the first one is the investment sufficient to meet the recommendations? I think that's in essence what you're asking. We believe it is. What we've tried to do here is be reasonable. I think we could have come up with an equation, and I think the first draft of this involved even a more extensive potentially investment, and we've cut that back, so we're mindful of the recession that we're operating in and the financial restrictions, but we think we've got an investment here which is substantial and should provide a good basis for moving the department forward to achieve that good rating that which we aspire to achieve. So remind me what the second question was, sir?
Yes. How have you arrived at your figure for what the appropriate caseload should be, which is a key factor in all of this? I mean, SIPF was mentioned. We could see that in the report. Yeah. I just wondered how you've arrived at this figure. Okay.
So yes, we did make in the report does reference the SIFRA work where they compared caseloads in number of authorities, and in that piece of work, I think they were making a clear argument, which moves on to your third point, about that actually authorities that seem to be well managed were actually had reasonable levels of caseloads, and that so that's where we based our work on, the SIPFA work. Plus, if you look at Ofsted inspections, that you can see from that the kind of caseloads that operate in good authorities. If you look at the two outstanding authorities that Ofsted had identified at the time of putting this report together, there has been a third one that's occurred very recently, but at the time of this report, caseloads were significantly lower even than what we're proposing here, which was down almost to single figures in some of the two London boroughs that were identified as outstanding. There is no definitive standard. Ofsted doesn't specifically say to you, this is the required standard. There is no statute or law that says that you have to have this sort of standard. So what you have to do is look at the authorities that are performing at a good level, look at the work that SIPFA was undertaking, and on the basis of that, we thought we'd come to a sound figure of this 14 to 17. What we then did on top of that is that you then have to work on the basis of, for instance, for a newly qualified social worker, in their first year of practice, the expectation is that they have a reduced caseload. Obviously, they've come straight off college, they're not completely the finished article, and so what we want to be doing is providing a reduced caseload for them so they've got a chance to develop over the first year to become a fully efficient social worker. Equally, we have senior practitioner social workers who are almost like, deputy team managers. So they will be doing an element of supervision of other staff, plus dealing with some of the most complex cases. So in order to do that, you would provide a lower caseload for them to give them the capacity to do that piece of work. So those are the factors that we take into account in coming to this equation. And in the body of Annex C, I think it goes through team by team, explaining where we think we are with each of these positions and why we want to invest resources in that way. So we think that if we achieve and consistently operate within the 14 to 17 range, accepting that senior practitioners, newly qualified social workers have reduced caseloads, then there's no reason why that we couldn't achieve that good rating. As I say, in terms of the investment side of things, I think the CIPFA report, which is evidence in here, and I can give you, perhaps outside of the meeting, a direct link to it. I think that's exactly the work that they looked at in terms of if caseloads actually go up, what happens is then you often have authorities start to, care proceedings go up, a lot of other things go up, you start taking on loads of agency workers, the whole system starts to creak a bit, and you end up then having to put lots of additional money into the department to make it work.
I think the last point was page 12, paragraph 12, with regard to the significant financial risks for not investing. And essentially, you were asking, I think, Mr. Sheehan, what those significant financial risks are. Is that right?
I think Paul's answered that with respect, Chair. I think he's covered that point now. What I would say, though, in conclusion, is that I think we need to keep an eye on this. We need to see that this £2 or £2.5 million investment is being used appropriately, and these caseload figures are, I think, a very good indicator, and I would be grateful if we could receive more regular reports as we progress to see how the caseloads are improving, hopefully, in all areas. So that would be, I think, useful and important for us in our role as Scrutiny Committee to keep an eye on that.
In terms of that, Mr. Meredith, do we audit the number of case reviews that each social worker or each person has on a monthly basis? And if so, could that be provided to the committee?
Yes, we do. Excuse me. Yes, we do. And it's something that we've looked at. And over the last year, we've got a lot more sophisticated about how we keep that data. So we can routinely report that, and I do think it's one of the most important factors in terms of achieving our recovery, that if we can keep caseloads at a manageable level, that will give us the opportunity to achieve the standards that we want in other areas. So it's very important.
Thank you. And indeed, the caseload does seem to be the main driver for all of this. But a question that I had was in relation to the legal costs and how the $2 million, the additional $2 million that we're talking about here, is going to be split between, say, for instance, the legal cost requirement and indeed the additional employee requirement. Is that also something that you could possibly provide to us in the broadest sense?
Yes, as I pointed out earlier, one of the big drivers here has been also in these investments is not only the Ofsted, but the fact that, excuse me, our number of children being looked after has increased nearly 40% over the last 4 years, and our number of care proceedings have increased significantly as well, as I pointed out earlier. So they're almost to the point of doubling since 2010-11. And that's been one of the factors why we've had to put additional resources into legal services. So the amount that we're putting in there, the report evidence is solicitors that we're going to put in. Also, we are going to make an investment of £500,000 in terms of meeting some of the legal pressures that are built up in terms of the overall numbers, but also the complexity of cases that we're now dealing with. We have to instruct expert witnesses. We're finding that we're having to use counsel, barristers, a lot more than we did previously because of the complexity. The other factor that's impacted on us is the timelines that are now approached on care proceedings, where they have to be completed within 26 weeks. Plus, as I say, the overall pressure. These are all factors that over the period have led to significant additional costs in terms of our legal services. So by making this investment, we think we're now in a position to have a properly financially viable service to take us forward into the future.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? Yes, Mr. Welsh.
Thank you, Chairman. At the last full council meeting, I posed a question to Ivan. When would we see an action plan in terms of how we deal with the issues raised by Ofsted, particularly with some milestones on there? And then at the agenda-setting meeting for this, we talked about seeing some form of timetable. What we have received in the pack is Appendix B, which has got quite considerable detail. In fact, it's very useful in understanding the issues. And in parallel to that, we've got the paper about resourcing. So I can deduce from that that a lot of work has had to be done to understand what resources we need in place to supplement the page on a plan that we have. But up till now, we still don't have any milestones. So I'm guessing it's that I'm pushing a little early for that, but it would be interesting to know a date of when we might see milestones or a plan that had dates on it, so that members can. It's very hard for members to deal with Appendix B, which is in a sense a very professional paper. I'd like to see something that is easier for members to track, to see where are we and how will we know we're getting there. Maybe you can give me some steer on where we're going with that.
Clearly, we have our performance information that we routinely report to committee, and we can continue to review that and review our performance on that. So that's one element that we can look at. A lot of the elements in the Ofsted report were actually getting bodies in position and reducing caseload. So yeah, now that we've got this, or we've got these proposals going forward to Cabinet for this investment, if that's approved, then we can start to put these things in place. And I think we can firm up in certain areas, like for instance caseloads and things like that, where we can achieve those caseloads. I mean, it's not easy to recruit social workers, so it will take a period of time as well. And although we've had some posts recently that we've advertised, we're struggling to fill those. And again, Leicestershire's not unique in that. It's a picture that occurs all over the country. So that's another factor that could impact on that. But I do think we will be able to firm this up in certain areas now that, if this investment is agreed. The other element to this is some of this involves qualitative assessments. So in order for us to get those qualitative assessments, it may well be that in the future we would want some independent scrutiny of the progress that we've made, maybe via some form of peer review or some other review like that, rather than waiting for another Ofsted. And in those situations, you then get professionals working in other areas to come and critique the work that you're doing, because a lot of it is to do with the quality of work, etc. And that then does revolve largely around case audits, etc. And that's the way that Ofsted works on a lot of their work as well, isn't it? Talking to workers, meeting service users, getting feedback from those people. So I think probably in the new year we'll be looking for some form of validation in that sense, and I think that would be quite useful in terms of showcasing the progress that I feel confident that we'll have made in that period of time.
And again, Mr. Welsh, yes?
Yeah, that's actually quite useful, but I do think it's important that members of the Scrutiny Committee actually understand the progress we make. There's no point having a Ofsted report that says we require improvement if we can't monitor what is that improvement and when have we achieved a reasonable standard. So I do think it's important that we, as members, track that, and there is a risk that we are reassured by professionals that the work's underway. I think we need to see something more tangible than that. I think that we were certainly advised by previous incumbents of the post that Paul now fills that of what our report might be, and I think we were to some extent misled's too strong, but I think we were encouraged to believe we'd have a better report than one we did. So I do think we need to make sure that we now pick up from that and make sure that things are back on an even keel.
Thank you, Mr. Welsh. Mr. Meredith, in terms of anticipated timelines, however optimistic they may be, is there any room to have anticipated timelines within the context of that action plan, or could you possibly give consideration to that? Because we all know that if you have a timeline in place, even if it is going to be flexible or subject to some variance, that is better than having no timeframes in place at all.
I mean, there are clearly some timeframes in the report already, and some of the things that we've put in place are evidenced in the report that they've been achieved. So I think it would be a bit unfair to say that they're not in the report in that sense, and I'm happy to go back and review that and see whether we can firm that up a little bit more in terms of where we are. But some of them will be simply things saying our caseloads were this and now our caseloads are this. And once you're there, you've achieved that in a sense. And the reporting that we're getting on our caseloads now would be evidence of where we can do that. But I'm happy to go back and review this and more than happy to perhaps bring it to the next committee with where we've gone through and looked at this and see if there's some way that we can firm up some of the things. But it is really dependent on this additional investment, and I think, given that that proposal is going to Cabinet, once we're in that place, and then we can start actioning those sort of investments, and then I think we'll be in a much better place to firm up some of the proposals.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or queries on this particular item? Nothing else from anyone? Okay. All right. Then we'll move on to the next item. Our comments will be submitted to Cabinet, no doubt. So we move on to item number 9, the Leicestershire and Rutland Local Safeguarding Children Board Annual Report. It's on page 39 to 116 of your agenda pack. Simon Westwood is here with us, the independent chair of the Leicestershire and Rutland Safeguarding Children's Board, and he's going to be presenting the report here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to present the report. You'll be aware I'm new chair to Leicestershire, and it's important to stress this report is a retrospective report which covers the period up to March 17. So I'm indebted to the staff and the previous chair for the work they've done to produce this report, and my role is to present that and to make sure that we take things forward this year. I'll be fairly brief. I just wanted to explain the process really from our point of view going forward. The aim is to have the final report signed off by the Safeguarding Board on 20th of October. So the opportunity for today is for people to feed in views or comments. It's also going to Cabinet on Friday, and also it's circulated to Rutland Council because there are joint reports as well with similar things but some differences. So that in terms of process, after that the board are required to sign it off. It will then go, as is required by regulation, to the leader of the council, the chief executive, the chair of the Health and Wellbeing Board and the Police and Crime Commissioner. They are named individuals in the regulations. So that aside, the key messages I think from the report are set out in the covering report on page 41, which I think are self-explanatory, and there are a number of issues there. It's opportune really to comment in relation to the last item, if that's appropriate, because there is an overlap here with some of those things that the board have identified as areas for improvement, which are reflected in your earlier discussion. So it's really pleasing to hear that those things are being addressed and tackled, because they are areas that the board had identified as concerns. And also, in terms of taking things forward, I can give Scrutiny the assurance that the Safeguarding Children Board will also have an interest in those specific areas of safeguarding that are set out in the improvement plan, and we would want in next year's annual report to make comment on progress made specifically around those appropriate areas overlapping with safeguarding. I suppose I wanted to just highlight a couple of things really, and again there is a sort of an overlap really, but there's very strong partnership working in relation to child sexual exploitation across Leicestershire, and no doubt all of you will be fully aware of some of the tragic cases and difficult cases that relate to that. But the board has found that work immensely supportive. As Paul mentioned in the previous comments, there is still some work to do, I think, on the wider partnership working, and there are particular areas of overlap with other boards around particular areas where I think there's some need to clarify some of the leadership and governance arrangements. There are two other things I just wanted to highlight was, and it does link to the comments on caseloads, is one of the areas for development and improvement was in the first response service, and I've already had a conversation with the director about the board taking an interest in understanding how that is progressing, and we've certainly already been having conversations around that this year. Finally, I think just to point out that the Children's Social Work Act came into force in 2017, and I've highlighted it that will bring with it this year changes to the arrangements for safeguarding for children, and that is a part of the forward plan. The board were aware of that last year and obviously flagged that up in the report. We will be making some detailed proposals and plans around that for the following year, which obviously will appear in this year's report for 17-18. I think I'll leave it there and take comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westwood. Do we have any questions from the floor? Yes, Mr. Welsh.
Thank you, Chair. There's a couple of references in the report to the multi-agency CSE team, and I sort of really wondered whether is there a veiled implication that the Safeguarding Board are worried that the correct governance isn't in place, or that partners aren't sort of pulling their full weight, because we're sort of reassured that the police, the various authorities are all committed to it and it's all working well. Is this because the report is historic that those concerns are raised, or is it still an ongoing concern?
I think there are two separate things. Operationally, I think that's working well. I think in terms of the relationship of the board and the board's role in governance of that, because there is a CSE executive that's been established, but it's relatively early in its life. So I suppose I'm just being cautious about ensuring that we keep an eye on that governance arrangement and make sure that reporting is coming through to the board. In fact, I have asked for a report from that executive to come to our October meeting to make sure that we can see that things are on track as a board.
Thank you. Yes, Mrs. Taylor.
A couple of questions, if I may, Chair. The first one's about on page 54 of the agenda pack, the fourth from the bottom, the increase in referrals in the addressing of backlogs led to a reduction in the proportion of assessments being completed within 45 days from 92% to 77%. So that's quite a big drop. It does say in there it's an anomaly, but are you able to shed any more light on that as to what the reason might be? Is my first question, please.
First of all, to say, obviously, that's the historical data refers to a time when I wasn't around, so I haven't scrutinised the data personally. I think what I do know about that issue is that there were issues about how, I'm trying to avoid being too technical here, there were issues about how contacts were recorded and whether they were recorded as referrals or contacts. And I think the understanding was that there were some initial assessments that were originally started and closed quite quickly. That's been addressed. I've had assurance from the Assistant Director in relation to that very recently. And so part of that is that the improvement in quality of the assessment has made a difference to the time period has been reduced. So in simplistic terms, what I wouldn't want to see is chasing a target of a time scale. I'd rather see the quality of the assessment improve, because the time scale is, obviously it's a national time scale, so it's there and it's set, but it's most important that the quality is the focus, not chasing a time scale.
Thank you, Mr. Meredith.
Yeah, just adding to what Simon said is that if you, again, refer you to the Ofsted report, and this is a key feature within the Ofsted report. So previously our performance on assessments was seen to be quite good, and then it tailed off, I think leading up to the inspection, and that was to do with some of the increased caseloads that were operating, very high caseloads in the team. We had a lot of newly qualified social workers in the team who had very high caseloads as well, which was inappropriate. The other interesting factor here was that although our performance previously had been very high, the actual numbers of assessments that we undertook was actually very low comparatively. So one of the big features in the Ofsted report was this delay. Remember they talked about, if we identify a case that requires intervention around child protection, then we act that very well. But where the cases are deemed to be just below that, there's a lot of drift in the system and a lot of delay in things being progressed. So, as Simon has said, and as is referenced in the continuous improvement plan and the developments we've made, we put lots of extra resources into that team. We have significantly reduced the caseloads in that team, and the performance is significantly improving and will continue to improve over the period of time. So we've removed any backlogs that were in the system as well. They're reducing significantly. So I think in terms of the progress we're making, I think there's a good example of an area where we're not completely there yet, but we are starting to make good progress.
Thank you, Mr. Meredith. Mrs. Taylor, you had follow-up questions.
Yeah, a second question on page 62 of the agenda pack, please, about children educated at home. So at the end of 16-17, there was 440 compared to 321. You said it's an issue in other areas. Have we have any more reason as to why that's gone up? Is there any particular reason that we know of?
I'm again apologise, members, but I'm not being around at the time of the detail. I don't know if there's a particular concern that was raised there. I think the reporting of the numbers is important, and I think what we do need to do is to understand that. Reference to other areas, there has been a number of case reviews over some years which have reflected some of the difficulties in this area, and there's quite polarised opinion on this, and probably rightly so, in the sense that it's absolutely clear that it's the right of parents to provide education with their children, and many choose to do so, and many choose to do it and do it excellently. But there are some inherent risks in that for some vulnerable children, and I suppose it's important that we have strong monitoring systems within the local authority, because that's where the responsibility will lie in terms of education, to ensure that the robust systems for supporting those parents and monitoring those parents are working as well as they can be. It's also important for members to understand that the local authority has no statutory power to intervene in those circumstances, unless, of course, there is a serious incident or a safeguarding concern. So it's quite a complex area, but it is an area where the board are right to keep an eye on, because there are in other parts of the country, have been in other parts of the country, children who are not known in the system at all because they've never been registered with the school, they're not registered with health professionals, and therefore they are potentially more vulnerable and at risk because they're hidden from view from agencies. But it is a small proportion, and we need to understand that.
Thank you very much. I think, Jane, you wanted to come in at this point?
Yeah, just to follow up what Simon said, we do monitor within the local authority all children who are electively home educated, and it's a regional and national issue in terms of the increased numbers of children that we're seeing. The legislation requires us to ensure that we are visiting every single child who's electively home educated, and as Simon did point out, this is an area that does require focus, and it's part of our overall monitoring of all children who are missing education or who are not in education for other reasons as well. So it is something that we monitor closely, and Ofsted are starting to look in more detail as well about.
Thank you very much. You have any other follow-up questions, Mrs. Taylor? No, nothing else. Anyone else? Any other? Mr. Old.
On the subject of home education, I think Mrs. Taylor is quite right to highlight the report from the LSCB. 1 in 5 children have not had a required visit. I would have thought this scrutiny committee couldn't be satisfied with that statistic. Now, historically, when the Every Child Matters agenda was set up under the Labour government, which all parties supported, the issue of children at home, which requires national legislation to change the current position, was left in abeyance. Under the coalition government, it has been left in abeyance, and under the Conservative government, the position continues. In the meantime, you've had children like Kyra Ishak in Birmingham, who social workers were refused access to, dying in her own house. And it is a national issue. It's not something that we as a local authority or you as a scrutiny committee can deal with. It requires a change in legislation nationally. But I don't think 1 in 5 is a satisfactory position.
Thank you, Mr. Old. Anyone else? Mrs. Page.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Westwood. In the recent, or I think in the past 2 SAP meetings, it was clearly identified that statistics and performance data wasn't collected from the same starting point, and there were different standards. And as a lot of the working, or most of the working, is based on having accurate performance data and the statistics, it's more a plea rather than a question. Can we ensure that the monitoring to make that the data, the performance data, sustainable, that it is all the same coming from all agencies, i.e. what I mean is that they have the same common nominators in order to be credible to move forward on. So I think it was recorded. Jane can probably help us out there. But is there anything in the pipeline to ensure that all the agency performance data is credible and comes from the same nominator? Thank you.
In terms of comments around that, there's a broad point, which is that absolutely right that the performance data, as far as we can get it, needs to be robust. It needs to be reflecting the same periods with the same understanding. having said that, it's not that easy to do that, because sometimes the reporting cycles for different organisations for different purposes, i.e. They reporting to government in different ways. So it is an extra piece of work to do that. What the board does is we have separate performance meetings where we are trying now to slim that down to make sure that we can get a core set of data that we're confident about. And I think what we need to improve on is the qualitative data that we get, which is from case audits and those sort of things, so that you can not have to rely too much on the statistics, but understand the story behind that through audits. And that's certainly an area this year we're trying to develop further. But it's an ongoing challenge. I don't know whether colleague wants to make a comment, but I think there's a new performance information system that's been established, which will make some improvement to that.
I think, Mr. Meredith, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, we are introducing. My colleague from Business Intelligence, who's sitting over there, is going to join us in a minute to give us our performance report. They've been leading on the development of a new system called Tableau, and that is a really exciting piece of software that we're introducing in the department, which is very accessible and will allow us to interrogate our data much easier and in a much more accessible way. So that's, in a sense, the piece of software that we're actually talking about. But I just reiterate the point that Simon made about this qualitative data, and I was making that point earlier when we were talking about improvements in terms of the Ofsted side of things. So sometimes you can look at performance data, and I remind members that some of the performance data that was available for this department pre-Ofsted, you could read that and assume that things were quite well. But what you have to do is look below the data, and that's where the qualitative side of things that Simon's talking about, doing the case audits, and we're doing a lot more of that in the department now as well, and would give you that extra added value, as it were, in terms of what you want to do. So it is always important to look beyond the data, and I'm sure colleagues would appreciate that.
May I come back, please, Chairman?
Yes, Mrs. Page.
Very quick. You're talking about software and you're talking we, so I assume County Council. However, it is also our partners. For instance, the Community Safety Partnership collects across 2 different data systems, the NHS. So, and it is not only us, it is the others. So is that being included? Are they encouraged so we have one standard and there are no disparities in the collection and in the translation? Thank you.
Do you want to come back on that, Mr. Meredith?
I think we'd all aspire to that, and there's been numerous attempts by government over years to actually achieve that. It's a great idea, and I think we would all sign up to that. But it is very difficult because of the different systems, different ways that people communicate and they talk about. But it's something that we aspire to achieve, and the Safeguarding Board obviously is doing a lot of work to try to improve that. But sometimes what you then have to do is go outside of the system. I'm sorry I keep labouring this point, but I think it's so important. At the end of the day, this performance data is indicative. It gives you an indicator, and what you need to do is really get below that to find out actually what's happening. It gives you a pointer. So I think the essence of this, and I'm not going to put words in Simon's mouth, but I mean, in a sense, that's what he's saying, and I think that's what we aspire to in the department is performance data is very important, but you've got to get below it, and that will really tell you then the quality of what you're doing in terms of the interaction with families or whoever.
Thank you, Mr. Meredith. I think we've gone as far as we can on that particular issue. It's obviously a very complex area. Canon Lewis, you have a question?
Chair. And I think this probably builds on a little bit from what Paul's been saying there. With reference on page 61 under Safeguarding in Education, it talks, Simon, about safeguarding annual returns completed, showing good compliance with policies, procedures and practice. I suppose my observation would be it's quite difficult to judge practice through an annual return. And how do you go about digging underneath the indicative data, as Paul has said? And then further down, schools have been helped to achieve successful outcomes in safeguarding, with all schools inspected being rated effective. Again, we're all aware of the times when Ofsted has checked compliance, but actually practice on the ground doesn't reflect that at all. I don't know whether either Simon or Paul or Jane want to respond. Thank you, Chair.
Who wants to take those two questions in the first instance? Simon?
I'll just make a general point, and then Jane can talk about the detail. I think the general point is that with the changes in the Children's Social Work Act, this is a key area that is unclear going forward. And so there is a significant piece of work to understand that. The government are introducing new guidance, which we anticipate now in November. That guidance is around safeguarding arrangements. As yet, it's unclear, but it doesn't appear to include schools as key partners in this. There is, of course, separate guidance for schools, which exists. So the future role of safeguarding arrangements and the relationship with schools is something that needs to be further clarification, I think.
Thank you very much. Mr. Meredith, OK. Jane, you're going to follow up.
Thank you, Chair. Just in terms of the first question that you asked around the safeguarding return, you're right, it's difficult to get an indication from an annual return around the practice, but I think one of the things we've done well in Leicestershire is ask a different set of questions that enables us to dig a bit deeper. We're really pleased that most schools return the survey, and that's both maintained schools and academies, so we have a good relationship with schools. I think the other bit to add is that we have other processes in place to triage some of that information as well. And some of that comes through notifications from Ofsted, some of it comes through conversations in regards to practice from schools. So there's a number of other things that's going on to triage alongside the annual return as well. And then in relation to the schools being supported to achieve the successful outcomes, obviously that's in relation to work we do with schools to support them in their safeguarding practice. And again, it would sit alongside the inspections that Ofsted undertake in relation to their confidence around safeguarding as well.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions or comments on this item? Yes, Louise.
I'd just like to comment on the theme running through today really seems to be on strong management and monitoring regularly. And I think it's going to be important going forward. All these things are extremely important to residents and those people who have these issues, and I think we need to have quick timescales, and we also need to ensure management are leading properly on this.
Mr. Ard.
Chair, I think it would be remiss of me not to draw Scrutiny's attention to a number of areas in the report that I think you may want to examine in the future. For instance, on page 55, there's reference to a joint piloted approach with the police, and I would have thought Scrutiny would be interested in a progress report as to how that is going forward. On page 60, and I am surprised that you haven't raised this, care leavers in suitable accommodation. The target should be 100%. Anything less means that a young man or young woman is in unsatisfactory placement. And I think that you're going to have to, at some stage in the future, look at that. And also the fact that we still not are getting 100% of initial health assessments carried out in time. These should be, almost like breathing, a matter of course. On the safeguarding returns that Caroline has just referred to, I think the report would have been stronger if we'd been told how many schools had been contacted and how many schools had actually responded and what had happened to the schools who hadn't responded. And that's the sort of factual information that is the difference between asking questions and actually having the answer provided for you. On page 64, who is the lead for children and young people mental health transformation plan? Are you going to see a copy of this transformation plan? Will you play any part in actually saying whether or not, from your viewpoint, you think it's adequate? And then at page 94, and this embarrasses me, at the end of the year, assurance was still outstanding from the police and Leicestershire County Council. And I'm really surprised that one of you hasn't put the question to me, why was this? But since you haven't done so, I'm happy to duck it. Thank you, Chair.
Well, since you raised it, Mr. Old, would you like to answer your own question, please?
I will pass that to the Director, Chair.
Fair enough. Mr. Meredith?
Chair, while the Director is thinking, can I just point out that all of the numberings are wrong and it's very difficult to follow if you could take it up, because my colleagues are different to mine on the pages and the agenda reports as well. They've all got different numbers and it's very difficult to follow because I'm struggling to find the pages Mr. Old just referred to. Thank you.
Mrs. Page, I think the reference is to the numbering at the top of the page in the middle, page 94, as opposed to the numbering on the bottom right. So page 94 is the top of the page. Do you see that?
Regardless, the agenda item, for instance, it's on 1, 2, it's 8 on the thingy, so it is all slightly mixed up.
No, and I did raise that point before the meeting, Mrs. Page, so it has been noted, and hopefully next time that will not occur. Thank you.
Shall I answer now? I've got
yes,
it now.
Mr. Meredith, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to refer back to the Ofsted inspection again, because this is something that was actually picked up in the Ofsted report. So this is an area of weakness in the authority in terms of our competency framework and how we assess and evaluate social workers as they develop and they move up the salary scale. And there was no systems that were operating in the department to actually evaluate that. So what we've done, and if you go back to the proposed investments, you'll see in there's a whole section that relates to creating a dedicated resource to address those particular issues, and also to put some additional resources into a principal social work post, which is a post which looks at actually competence and standards in social work, and was a post that was recommended on the back of the Professor Munro review that was undertaken a number of years ago. So the department at that time only had a half-time post. We're proposing to create a full-time post and put a number of extra resources into that area, which is an area of significant weakness that was identified by Ofsted and which we concur with. And so whilst we weren't in a position to meet this requirement this year, I feel confident that in future years we'll be in a much stronger place to actually identify that. We've also got accreditation for social workers, which is now being introduced, a national initiative, and some of the additional resources that we're proposing that we put into this area will allow us to address those issues in a more structured and managed way than we have done to date.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meredith. Any other comments to follow up from that, or indeed from Mr. Old's comments before? Mr. Sheehan?
Yes. Just to assure Ivan, I'm having a meeting with Nikki and Liz Perfect about some suitable accommodation for care leavers on the 25th of September with a particular issue in my patch. So some of us are looking into that. But I really wanted to raise about the key messages on page 41, paragraph 15. D&E, there are some slight negative comments there about referrals for initial health assessments, which Ivan also mentioned, and also consistency of practice within agencies requires improvement. I would hope that we're not pinning all our hopes on caseloads sorting this out. I would hope that an appropriate level of monitoring and challenge is taking place within management to make sure these things are being picked up, because as we know, poor practice can get entrenched, and if we want to improve the staffing levels with respect to the ratio of children they're looking after, we also have to make sure they're now following best practice, because they should have the time to do it. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, I mean, I go back to Ofsted again. I mean, it was one of the key elements in the Ofsted report is about the inconsistency of supervision, of case supervision, and again, that's another area that we've highlighted that we need to invest and improve on in our work. So it is key, and it's one of the themes that we've been returning to today all the time about that. It's not just about performance information. As I say, you look at this authority pre-inspection, you'd say, oh, it's a high-performing authority, but when you actually look below that, it's not. It wasn't. And clearly, as you say, that's a key part of that is that management oversight. And that's why was one of the key elements why we got requires improvement rating by Ofsted in that particular area.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any other comments on this item? Yes, Mr. Westwood.
I just wanted, excuse me. I just wanted to give some assurance around the initial health assessments. I have actually written as a chair to all partners with relevant involvement in this, not just the local authority, but to health providers and the CCGs, asking for an update at our October board on progress on this. Because clearly it's a multi-agency issue and it's been stuck for some time. So it is something that I've done that. And indeed, I've had a reply from Councillor Old because this is also of concern to the Corporate Parenting Board, and essentially that's where the driver from this will come from. But the Safeguarding Board has taken an interest actively.
Thank you, Mr. Old.
I also co-chair the Corporate Parenting Board with a young person from the Older Children in Care Council, so it won't drop below the, it won't drop out of sight, let's put it that way. One final point from me, Chair. Page 98, number at the top of the page, refers to the statutory members of the LSCB, and it includes myself. Actually, my role on the LSCB is that I am not a full board member. I am what is categorised as a participating observer, and I do not take part in any voting. So I think perhaps if you read it under statutory members and you didn't know that, you would find that a misleading category.
Maybe we can have some clarity on that, Mr. Westwood.
That's very helpful, Councillor Old. I'll make sure that we accurately record that in future reports. Thank you.
Can I just ask if there are any of the statutory members that are not pulling their weight, not turning up regularly or anything like that? Because we talk about leading to delays, gaps in information, etc. Are all the board members attending regularly?
We, as you know, I'm relatively new. So as far as I'm concerned, at this moment in time, we get good attendance from all agencies. It sometimes substitutes, so it'd be good to have the same person more consistently, but we do get representation from most agencies most of the time.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the floor? No? All right. In that case, we'll move on to item number 10. Jane, do you want to present the report, please?
Thank you, Chair. The report that you have in front of you is the Q1 performance report, and I'm joined by my colleague Stuart on this item. So the report is for the period of April to June 2017, and you'll note in Appendix A and B that we've attached the performance dashboard. Further to the last meeting, we have made some changes to the reporting framework. So you'll note from the reporting framework that Appendix A is now refreshed and only concentrates on those indicators where we have a refresh to report on at this board. We've also included in it quartile position information as well as trend charts as well, so it gives you some indication of progress or otherwise. So from the 45 measures that we've reported on, you'll note that 12 have improved, 19 show no significant change and 2 have declined. I'll take you through briefly each area of the report. So in relation to social care, the number of child protection cases reviewed within timescale is now at 99%, and that does place us in the top quartile nationally. Our child protection plans lasting for 2 or more years that were open at the end of quarter 1 is now at 1.8, so it remains similar to the quarter before. Our red indicator in this section is the percentage of children who are becoming subject to a child protection plan for a second or subsequent time, and you'll note that this rose from 20.8% to 13.8% and remains an area of focus for us. The other social care measures have remained similar to the previous quarter, so the percentage of children with 3 or more placements during a year is similar to the previous quarter, as is those care leavers who are in suitable accommodation. Care leavers in education, employment and training was at 46.9%, so it is slightly above our statistical neighbour average, but nevertheless an area that remains a focus for us. In relation to early help, the total number of individuals who've accessed early help has remained relatively steady, following a kind of general upward trend over the last year, as has the number of families who are receiving targeted support, both in terms of families and individuals. Our percentage claim for payment by results is now at 33%, and you'll recall that our target is to get to 100% by 2020. So we're making good progress there in terms of the national data. And there were 50 early help cases that were escalated to social care in the first quarter of this year, which was higher than quarter 4, when the figure was at 20. As discussed previously this afternoon, the percentage of children in care who've had their annual health assessment is now at 80.6%, which is a significant increase compared to the quarter previously, where we were at 67.3%. And the percentage of children in care who've had their dental check is at 74.3%. So it's very similar performance to the previous quarter. We report regularly on the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, which is our tool for assessing the risk of developing emotional and behavioural difficulties for our children in care. And we estimate that around 45% of children in care do have mental health issues, which is a significantly higher proportion compared to other children. You'll note that the total score we'll note from the report that if a total score of 17 is reached, then it will warrant an assessment and possible referral to the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service. We're currently in the 3rd quartile performance because our average score is at 16, which is just above the benchmark that we've set in Leicestershire. In relation to SEN, there were 375 young people assessed for a plan, which is higher than the figure in the previous year, and only 36 initial requests for assessment were refused, but that was an increase compared to the year before. Of those children assessed, 98.4% had a plan issued. And overall, there were 3,350 young people in Leicestershire now with a statement or EHCP. In relation to performance around children and young people and their families living with thriving communities, the department continues to perform well, both in terms of children entering the criminal justice system for the first time. We are above average nationally around rates of reoffending per offender, so our performance is particularly strong there, as is our performance around young people in custody, which remains low. In relation to early years, the number of the percentage of those people eligible for 2-year free early education entitlement was 80%, which is similar to what we've reported on throughout last year, and the percentage of eligible 3- and 4-year-olds who are taking up their offer is at 95%, again similar to previously. And our percentage of childcare providers rated as good or outstanding is at 94%. Particularly pleasing is the Leicestershire performance around education data, and you'll note from the data that we're providing for primary schools, we don't have our secondary data yet, is that our provisional data is showing an increase in performance across all key stages for children at primary school, including an increase around good level of development for children in early years foundation and key stage 2 reading, writing and mathematics. However, there is still a gap between those vulnerable groups' achievement and non-vulnerable groups' achievement across all key stages. And again, in relation to economy, employment and skills, the percentage of children who are not in education, employment or training across Leicestershire remains high, although the figure for young people with SEND is higher than the national figure for Leicestershire. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mrs. Richardson.
Can I just ask what we're doing about the emotional well-being of children in care? We're saying we have a level, a benchmark, and we're okay with sticking at that. But what are we doing to bring that down?
Yes, Nikki Collins.
Thank you. It's been a particular area of interest and concern for ourselves and our partners. And for the last year and a half, I've been working with them to look at a strategy to improve provision for children, particularly with emotional well-being needs. Because what we find is where children have mental health needs is they actually do get a service from CAMHS, but actually when it's emotional well-being needs and a complex one, they don't meet the threshold for CAMHS. We had a gap in provision. So we've been working for the last year and a half to try and address that. The SDQ score is just the first, I suppose, first step in the process of identifying, or one of the steps in the process of identifying that a child has got an emotional well-being need, in that it gives us an indicator and a pointer that there's something going on for that child. Now, 18 months ago, Leicestershire didn't actually use the SDQ score process, even though it was a requirement. So at the end of last year, you will know or recall that actually our completion rate was only at 17%. At the end of That's the previous end of last year. It was sitting at 55% and it's higher still. So that we do have the score to give us an indication. And why it's important, and a very good example, is that we have a young person, or an 11-year-old, with an SDQ score of 26. And I wanted to understand whether or not that child would flag with us in any other way. So non-school attendance, exclusions, behavioural issues, and actually not. He's flying under the radar. He's one of our quiet children who don't present usually in a classroom with any kind of needs. They're just sad and probably not getting the kind of services they need. So the SDQ score helps level that playing field, in that we will be able to identify the children, whether they're more overt about their needs or quiet about their emotional needs, and be able to provide them with the service. Some of the things that we've done over the last year, for example, is we piloted a scheme with CAMHS to have 10 consultation sessions a month for our social workers and our foster carers, where you don't have to go through the rigmarole of a referral to CAMHS. You can book yourself into one of these sessions and you can get CAMHS advice as to the kind of provision and services that that child might need. That might include just CAMHS's guidance as to how the carer and the social worker and the school should be working with that child, the kind of strategies that they can use to help that child. It might include a recommendation around a kind of therapy, in which case we now have a pot of money, funds, where we can fund that, because it doesn't fall into CAMHS's remit. So there's now a range of provisions that we provide that we hadn't provided a year and a half ago, and those are only two of examples of a range that we're implementing now.
Thank you. Yes, do you want to have a follow-up question?
Yeah, I think that's it's important to get these things early, because it obviously falls into so many other areas as these children grow up, and it has a cumulative effect on them going forward. Also, on the amber, where we're showing similar, I'm presuming we are still trying to better those, and we have actions in place to do that?
Generally, yes. Yes, obviously all of the areas where there are plans in place to improve our performance, to get to the top quartile in each of those, that would be our objective, to do that over the period of time. So, as I say, that's very important for us, but just to reiterate the point we were making earlier, it's very important that, we get to those top quartiles in here, but we also look below those to find out the qualitative aspects of what we do, and that's very important as well, that we need to add to this data as well.
Thank you. I have a question in relation to the percentage of children being subject to a child protection plan for a second or subsequent time. Obviously, that's quite a significant increase from 13.8% to 20.8%. Can you give me some explanation in terms of that, please?
Yes, members will remember this has been an issue for us for a period of time. I think it was referenced earlier. Last year, I think early on in the year, actually before I arrived, it was up in the region of almost 40% at one point. So we've made significant progress over the years to get it down to, over the year, a good performance overall for the year, which took us into the top quartile, was just under 14%. So that's gone back up over the last period up to 20% again, which pushes us back down into the bottom quartile, as you say. Even if we look at last year, month on month, there was a variation between the figures. So I think what we were saying generally, and even I was saying to this committee, just because we're at a good performance now doesn't mean we would be over the period. You've got to look at a long period. That's the first point. So we keep it constantly under review, and we are auditing cases where they do have a second plan. Now that we've got a quality assurance team in place, we can routinely audit these cases and find out what's occurring, as it were. We noticed that all of the previous periods when children were on a plan was prior to when we introduced the signs of safety methodology, which members may remember was one of the key elements and was commented very positively on in the Ofsted report. So we think that there's evidence that is now starting to have an impact on these families. As I say, we're looking at in detail at all of the current plans, and these are being audited. We have routine performance meetings where we actually look at this. We're also starting to look at improving what we call our step up and step down processes. So when children come off a plan, what resources are they being given to make sure that they don't go onto a plan? That's one of the factors. We're also working very closely with our colleagues in adult services and the police about a thing that used to be called the toxic trio. It isn't called that anymore. It's called the trilogy of risk these days, and it involves mental health issues, substance misuse issues, and domestic abuse issues. And when we did the previous work on these kind of cases, those elements featured in a lot of the families that we were dealing with in these situations. So, for instance, we now have a revised domestic abuse forum that we're operating with the police. The police have it as one of their top priorities, and we're working very closely at those to try and address some of those issues. So I think with all these elements in place, and hopefully the new investments that we'll get on the back of the Ofsted inspection, we'll be able to target this and keep numbers at a lower level.
Thank you. Also, in terms of the health and well-being, I also noted the annual health assessment within the last 12 months was 80.6%, higher than the quarter four when the level was 67.3%. Do you still think that 80.6% is sufficient? Shouldn't that be at 100%, is my first question. And my second question is in relation to dental checks. 74.3%, with an internal target of 70. Why just 70%? Surely, again, that should be at 100%, shouldn't it? Sorry, yes, Nikki.
Sorry,
go ahead.
thank you. In relation to health checks, we're not satisfied with that where that is, and we would want it improved. And not that annual health checks are a significant concern to us. Those actually run quite smoothly and quite well. It's the initial health assessment that we've been struggling with over the last year. So we perform quite well with our annual check, and the kind of thing that we need to take, or factor that we need to take into consideration, is that we have a number of children who refuse their annual health check, and it's their right to refuse their annual health check. Where they do that, we do try and offer a different kind of provision. We ask whether they'd like to prefer to see the LAC nurse, but that still doesn't count in our statistical information as a health check that's been completed. So we don't just leave it there with the young person. It's more likely to be a young person that refuses than a child. So there are a number of factors that feed into our annual health check that we have to take into consideration. But our social workers know if that happened, then there's other services that we offer the young person. In relation to our initial health assessments, I was very pleased last month to know that that we had completed 100%, which was the first time in a long time that we were able to achieve a good outcome for a good result. But then I know, for example, this month, and hopefully it's an indicator of how closely we're monitoring it, we know we won't achieve 100% this month for two reasons. Number one, for initial health assessment, we have a young person who's refused already this month, and we have 4 children who, for their own well-being, it's a decision that we we've actually placed out of county, which means then we have to work with another health authority, and there are inherent delays. So we do monitor, and we do try and close those delays for children who are placed out of county. We work very closely with our health colleagues, because we know it is an issue for our children. So we are monitoring this monthly, and I get individual performance feedback on an individual child basis to know when something's gone out of time scale, where that is. What I'm looking for is that it is those factors rather than social work performance or systemic performance on our side, which was certainly what the case was a few months ago. So there's a general improvement there. Dental checks? Okay, so dental check performance last year was a lot lower, and actually our target then was 70% because we had a lower performance in the previous year. And we set a performance target of 70%. We've exceeded that, and we will carry on trying to strive for a higher success rate of dental checks.
In terms of that, is the other 25% of children who are not having that dental check, is that because of refusal as well? Is that what you're saying to me today?
No. Dental checks, some of them don't take place because they're too young, and our system doesn't allow us to record that actually it's a looked after child nurse that then sees that child, and then I have to individually go through those and identify that the ones that aren't being picked up in the statistic are actually children who are younger than 4. So there's that factor that we need to take into account. There are some children that refuse, and then we'll work with them over time to help them understand why dental hygiene is so important. And for other children, there are still systems problems and social work problems in terms of scheduling those quickly and on time. What we've implemented now is the same as what I've done with initial health assessments, is that for every child that's in care, I have feedback as to whether or not they've had their dental check, and if they've not had it, whether or not it's scheduled. Where that's not the case, then myself and the service manager follow up on it personally. So this year, we have a much tighter reign of control over dental checks that we've had in previous years.
Thank you, and I appreciate that the situation seems to be improving. Thank you. Does anyone else have any further questions? Yes, Canon Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. Scrutiny, I've heard me question this before, and I trust you'll indulge me in questioning it again, because it's something that I feel very strongly about. Ofsted outcomes, number 34 on page 121. again, standing at a apparently high level there. However, there's a large number of small schools in this authority, many of which are Church of England small schools. And small school cohort data can dip under the radar all the time. That, coupled with an Ofsted judgment that might be 5, even I think our oldest judgment is 10 years old. To what extent are officers satisfied that provision is leading to the strongest outcomes? And my second question, which I'll just run at the same time if I may. Everything I know as a former head teacher, Ofsted inspector and system worker is that everything is about the leadership. It's all about the leadership for our outcomes in schools. And what this doesn't capture is the difficulty that we are experiencing in recruiting head teachers at the moment. Yet time after time after time, I can only talk for the Church of England sector, I am supporting governors with no applicants or 1 applicant, or maybe if we're really lucky, 2 applicants. I wonder to what extent we could begin to start to look at that as a committee and monitor vacancies in leadership, because that is what's going to have the biggest impact in terms of educational outcomes. Thank you.
Jane, can you respond to that, please?
Thank you, Chair. In relation to your first point, Canon Lewis, obviously, as you're more aware than we are, that the Ofsted judgment doesn't necessarily give an overall judgment of the effectiveness of the schools, and that there are significant pressures around schools, around data sets. I think one of the things that we are getting better at in Leicestershire as a partnership is working with schools to identify where they're requiring support regardless of the Ofsted judgment. So the analysis is made around a wide range of areas, including leadership and management, outcomes for pupils, as well as financial information as well. And I think through the work we're doing with teaching schools and work we're doing through the Education Excellence Partnership, we're in a better place now to monitor the impact of provision on outcomes for children as well, which leads to the second point you raise. The issue around head teacher recruitment, and actually teacher recruitment in Leicestershire, is an issue that's now been identified by the Leicestershire Education Excellence Partnership as a key priority of focus for the forthcoming year. So education leaders, both in, across primary, secondary and special schools, are concerned about the impact of not recruiting good leaders or retaining good leaders in education is having on schools. So that's been picked up as a priority, and through that we want to be now monitoring much more closely the kind of movement of head teachers across Leicestershire, alongside working with partners to attract head teachers to Leicestershire and retain teachers and head teachers in Leicestershire. So it certainly is something that we can report back on through the Education Excellence Partnership, which is a collection of people who are responsible for education across Leicestershire.
I think we'd appreciate that. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Sheehan.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm a little confused. We had that discussion in the last meeting, all but briefly, about suitable accommodation for care leavers, which was down at 79%. And yet we look at the figures here, and I don't know if we're comparing like with like, but it does say that that's in the green with a figure of 90.6%. Now, I don't know if we are comparing like with like, but there appears to have been a dramatic improvement there. But at the same time, it could be that the figures are volatile because we're dealing with a small data set. Could somebody explain, please?
Who's going to take that? Nikki? Thank you.
We have seen a general improvement for our suitable accommodation. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is in relation to how we now record data. We had what we called a suitable accommodation summit a few months ago because I was concerned that we weren't recording all apples. We were getting a whole range of things. That although there is regulation that tells us what can be considered in most cases suitable or unsuitable. So, for example, a young person who's in custody can never be considered to be in suitable accommodation, as you would expect, and that's the box you've got to tick, not in suitable accommodation. For other children, it's more varied. So, for example, last year, social workers were ticking. We had a number of young people who had chosen to return home to their parents' care or their family's care, and although they were still our responsibility in terms of care leavers, that's where they wanted to live. Social workers had made judgments in that year that because the young person didn't have their own room, they were sleeping on a couch in maybe a study or open area, that accommodation wasn't deemed suitable. Now, the government doesn't tell us to press that tick to use that tick box. So when we met in our summit, we agreed a standard. So if a young person's living at home, they haven't got their own bedroom, are there any health needs? Are there any privacy needs? Is there any disability, which means we should be considering that they should have their own room? Are they in education, employment and training? So are there outcomes otherwise positive in that care, in which case we would deem it suitable accommodation. So we found that last year social workers weren't applying the same principles and the same standards. And now that we are doing that, we're getting much better outcome. For those children who are deemed unsuitable, there's a bit of a combination. Some of those who are struggling to settle into their provision and their accommodation for a range of reasons or personal needs, and others that are in custody who we can't deem to be in suitable accommodation. And this year we do have a number of those.
Yeah, I mean, we'll pick this up in the next couple of weeks when we have a meeting, but I think it's worth saying that young people leaving care are often at a particularly vulnerable stage in their life, and we need to make sure that they are getting the proper support they need, give them a chance to get a good start as an adult.
Thank you. Any other questions you wanted to come back, Nikki?
Just a very brief comment to say that we did acknowledge that, and it did come out of our Ofsted inspection. And if you see, one of our caseloads that was the highest in the report that Paul presented was for our care leavers in terms of our need for personal advisors.
Thank you, Mrs. Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Just a bit of clarity, please, about Key Stage 2 and maths, reading and writing. Within these figures, does that include children with barriers to learning, for example, deafness or vision problems and things like that? Does that come under the EHCP pupils, or is that the data for that somewhere else? Thank you.
Yes, Jen?
Yep, just to clarify, so the figure referenced at paragraph 37 is our results for all pupils who are in Key Stage 2. The detail in paragraph 40 gives the statistics for those children who either have a statement, which very few now because we've converted, but that the figure in paragraph 40 is for those who have a plan.
Yes, Mrs. Seaton.
Thank you, Chair. My first comment would be this is a lot better presented than it was, as I remember, the last one. I think it was on it was just not very easy to read and comprehend. I want to question an omission, and I think I brought it up last time. The initial, I'm looking at the children and young people with health and well-being and life chances improved. Where you've got the initial request for EHCPs refused, which is 36, and it depends which side you're looking on, whether it's better or worse, that. But you did have, I believe, a section before about going to appeals. How many went through to appeals? And that was the question I asked, because there was several on there. And it's omitted now, so I wondered whether any of those had gone to appeals and whether they were upheld or not. Thank you.
As I said at the beginning of the report, one of the things that we have done to make it clearer is that we've taken out the data that we don't have any new data on. So the appeals data will still appear. It's just it's annual data, so it's not appeared in this point. So it does look like an omission, but it's partly how we cleaned up the report to make it clearer. So that data is annual data, and it will come into a forthcoming report.
Okay, any other questions or issues to be raised, please? Members? No? Okay, well then let's move on then to, thank you very much, Jane. Move on to item 11, Annual report of the Independent Reviewing Officer, pages 131 to 176 of your pack. Paul, if I can ask you to present the report, please.
Chair, what I will do is just do a very quick introduction, and then my colleague Judith Jones, who manages the service, will go through the detail of the report and answer any detailed questions. So this is a requirement for us to produce this report annually under the IRO handbook, which is operated under care planning regulations. So there's a statutory requirement. Independent reviewing officers is a quasi-independent role from the council that's a requirement for us to operate. They chair LAC reviews, looked after children reviews, following the statutory requirements and regulations. They meet young people and they can advocate on behalf of young people. And in extreme circumstances, they can challenge the council on behalf of young people if they believe that the care plan that is being offered is not sufficient, adequate to meet that young person's needs. So it's a very important role, and this report gives us an overview of the activity that's happened over the last 12 months. I'll hand over to Judith.
Good afternoon. Just to follow on from what Paul is saying, the Independent Reviewing Officer Service has a key quality assurance responsibility, not just for children in care, but for children who are subject to child protection planning within the department as well, as detailed in the report. And this is an opportunity this afternoon to be able to share some of our achievements in the service over the year, highlight areas that have been a challenge, as well as look to the focus for this current year. A particular note in terms of achievements and receiving something that received positive comments from our Ofsted inspection in November, December last year, is the timeliness of important meetings for children. So, as Paul referenced, looked after children reviews, where there's a focus on their care planning, but also child protection conferences where we focus on children's child protection planning as well. Also, we have high participation levels of children in meetings about them and the contribution their voice makes to those meetings. So I think that's a particular achievement that we're very proud of within the service. Further achievement relates to improvements made by the Independent Reviewing Officer Service as regards timeliness of distribution of decisions and recommendations from LAC reviews in particular. This was an area of concern in last year's annual report, and we have and we continue to have a very strong focus on this, so we don't slip back and undo what we've achieved. So we have made improvements in that respect, which we're proud of. The third and final achievement highlight in this overview from me is that of the development and implementation of the Independent Reviewing Officer Quality Assurance Alert System that we commenced in September 2016. This is a system that supports the quality assurance function of the Independent Reviewing Officer Service and helps us to identify areas of concern, individual practice and thematics across the service, as well as pinpoint areas of good practice, and this helps to feed our development improvement journey across the department. Moving on to areas of particular challenge during the year. With rising numbers of children in care, those subject to child protection plans, it has been a challenge to consistently maintain high standards, and this can manifest itself in a number of ways, as pinpointed in the executive summary on page 138. However, successful growth bid that we've had will mean we can strengthen our numbers in the IRO service, and this will help meet the challenge moving forward. Whilst in no means detracting from the achievement that I've mentioned in terms of the quality assurance alert system, we know we have more work to do so that this can be used more consistently and robustly and help work more effectively, and we are actively working on this at the moment. To round off, despite the positive development work across the department that's highlighted in the report as regards work with children who display harmful sexual behaviours, we still feel there's a lot of work to be done to develop knowledge and skills in the workforce, and this is an area of current focus, and we're looking at creative ways to take this forward, and a number of proposals will be forthcoming over this current year.
Thank you, Judith. I think Mr. Welsh.
Hello, Judith. Welcome.
Hello. Nice to see
I can't
you.
believe it. Another year's gone by.
Yeah, it goes really quickly, doesn't it?
You'll have heard earlier we were talking about the percentage of children subject to repeat child protection plans has risen again.
Yes.
Just wondered what your perspective was, because you guys chair the initial child protection meeting and the review ones, I believe.
Yes,
so,
we do.
so an IRO is present when the plan comes to an end. So, what's happening? Is pressure being applied to end them? Is it that correct resources are not put in place afterwards? So, if you could just sort of fill in a bit. Do I take it that at the end of a child protection plan, we still may identify that as a child in need and have some form of plan? And are we doing that properly? So, really, just trying to understand from your perspective what we could do to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think all those things are really relevant. You're absolutely right. The IRO service, the conference chairs have a direct oversight and a degree of control as well in terms of ending of child protection plans. And I think we've worked closely with other areas across the department to try and understand some of the detail that sits underneath some of those indicators Paul was referencing earlier on. Just a couple of things really that I think will hopefully answer your question. After every conference, in terms of an analysis of the sort of the situation in the case, if we've had a situation whereby a child's been made subject of a plan in a repeat pattern, then the IRO will provide an analysis of information that sort of covers a number of bullet point areas that we ask them to look for. And that can range from how long ago was the previous period of child protection planning, what significant change of circumstances, if any, there have been within a family. So there's a plethora of information that we gather that then helps us to understand the analysis through the audit work that we do, and that contributes to that. In terms of practice from chairs, but also practice within the locality social work teams, the chairs, we've briefed and we monitor and reinforce a robust approach to plans ending. And there's a number of criteria that have to be met in order for a plan to end. And some of that is about management oversight within the locality teams. So if there's a proposal to come to a conference from the lead team to end that plan for the child, then we need to make sure that that's being quality assured, that assessment, that plan effectiveness has been quality assured by the manager, and there's clarity of understanding about why it's right at that time to end the plan for that child, and what further needs to be recommended in terms of maintenance and support of that. If it's not right in terms of child protection planning, but it is potentially right in terms of children in need planning, as you referenced. So that's one thing that we ask from the localities to come, and that's something that IROs have oversight of when they're chairing conferences. Equally, IROs are asked to be very robust and focused, not just with social work practitioners, but with our partner agencies at conferences, in relation to clarification about whether or not there's sufficient safety and we feel sufficiently assured that those plans and the components of those plans have been worked effectively and been met effectively. So we'll be looking through our signs of safety mapping within the conference to be really clear about what the safety is and what any continuing concerns are. And it's on that balance then that there's an endorsement or otherwise to end the plan for that child. So I think there are a number of measures that are put into place, that have been put into place and have been operational on the journey we've been through in addressing our repeat child protection plan performance. And that's round about sort of April 2015 we started on that journey.
Thank you. Yes, well, I had Mr. Kaufman down next, but are you just asking a follow-up question, Mr. Welsh? Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, trying to understand why is this happening? We need to change this. So, you mentioned management oversight, which is something that Ofsted picked up on. In a sense, you're somebody that we can look to give us advice on what is actually happening, and is it a lack of management oversight of what happens with those cases, or is it just a fluke of the complexity of them?
Most recent audit work that we've done that contributed to the performance reporting for the last quarter did some audit around what our cohort of child protection plan cases were looking like currently, and what we know from that information is that there's a variety of factors, but significantly, those cases that we're seeing coming back for child protection plans now are cases that have had plans ended in the previous period more than roughly two or 3 years ago or more. So we're talking about practice that existed some years ago, and the things that we've put into place since are measures to be more robust in terms of our work with children and families when we end plans and at a child in need basis. What we're also doing further to that, because we recognise that we need to understand more so that we're clearer about what the focus is for these families, is we're doing a piece of work with our early help colleagues. We've just started to plan that now in terms of trying to get underneath those cases that were open some years ago, ended for a plan years ago, have recently come back. We're trying to look at what was the quality of work in between that period. So we're starting to understand what focus, what services, what resources, not just from children's services but from our partner agencies, have been applied to support those families and maintain that low risk situation when it was agreed that plans would end some years ago. So we're starting to look at that now, and that is going to help us shape our targeted offer to children and families in terms of child in need support, with the idea being that will strengthen the services without the need for a child protection plan, but also give us an indicator of the sort of things that we need to be mindful of and have as contingency planning when we end plans, so that if, for example, families are coping fine with 2 children, but we know that a third and another pregnancy will really make a shift in that, then we're starting to look at ways in which we can track and monitor that through ourselves, through our partners, so that we can identify that at an early enough stage so that we can offer support and intervention and prevent it deteriorating into a child protection situation. Does that help?
Thank you. And yes, I think prevention is the key in that regard, isn't it? Yes, Mr. Welsh.
Could I suggest, Chair, that we refer this matter for more in-depth analysis at the Child Protection Panel? I think it'd be worthwhile spending a little time, because, of course, there is the cost of and the resources required to pick up subsequent plans, and preventative work may well be a cheaper solution. So we do have a Child Protection Panel, and it's something like that where we could pick this issue up. So I suggest that to members of that panel here.
Mr. Old and Mr. Pendleton, you have any comment on that?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, Mr. Welsh will know that he and I share the Child Protection Panel, and that I chair it. And I've been watching and listening to this debate quite intently. And I think the overall rider, first of all, and premise is that these are historical plans, and of course, as they become out of date, the individuals have then gone back to, if you like, normal routines, and only then have surfaced again. And so you're looking at something which, although shows an increase, is actually something which the new system, which Mr. Walsh and I know is in place to deal with, will deal with. And we will expect this for some time. So it's endemic, but we know it has to be dealt with, and I'm very pleased and will be very pleased to continue the pressure to Chairman to watch and make sure that those plans are improved all the time, and it's a rotating and continuous process. Thank you for allowing me to comment.
Essentially there, Mr. Pendleton, you're indicating that there's a time lag in terms of the process. When would you anticipate that the figures would catch up with themselves so that we're in a more reasonable position?
I am not absolutely sure that we should be in a position in 12 months' time, but I still expect that we will monitor a general downward trend. That's all I can offer you, Chairman, because this is complex and quite difficult. And I think that our systems here are getting more and more sophisticated at dealing with all those issues. And until we get to the point where we have dealt with them all, we won't actually see a bottoming. But I think we shall see a general reduction. That's what Mr. Welsh and I certainly were happy to note would be happening.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions on this item? Yes, Mrs. Richardson.
I note you say that practitioners and managers haven't always consistently responded to your alerts. Is there a gap in knowing roles and responsibilities in the teams and where you fit in, and practitioners and managers actually taking on board your advice, because there seems to be a gap there? And has this bringing the cases to the senior management team, is that a new thing that is hopefully going to address that?
I think in terms of understanding, I'm not sure that would be the most overriding factor in the issue that we have. And we've done a lot of work in the IRO service in promoting the role of the IRO and embedding that. And we've been on quite a significant journey over the last sort of 2 to 3 years in that respect. And I feel like we've got a much more strengthened, understood and robust position and understanding and working relationship within the department than we did have previously. I think sometimes some of the pressures that locality teams and managers are under, I understand in terms of workloads of staff that can sometimes impact on it. We continue to engage with our colleagues within the social care teams and encourage strong working relationships so that we can have dialogue about these issues, so we can encourage that response. And we look to our senior colleagues as well, so our heads of service, to our ADs, to help us push that message within the locality services, so that actually, rather than it being seen as something that's going on between two professionals, we're trying to push the message that actually this is about trying to deliver best outcomes for children and families. And actually that's all what we're coming at from just slightly different angles sometimes. So I think there is potential for us to do more work, I think, in terms of clarity of understanding, particularly because we do have new staff, we do have new managers, and we're looking at how we can incorporate the role of the IRO into staff induction programmes, as referenced previously to the sort of workforce development work that needs to come into play, that is being developed on the back of our Ofsted inspection. So we're working in terms of integrating those sort of roles into the induction programmes for staff, so it's clear from the outset. In terms of the impact of senior management meetings, we did have a little bit of a change in terms of some of our senior management officers. That meant we weren't able to keep the momentum going for a period of time, and I think I've reflected that within the report around the challenge meetings, for example, with the assistant director. But they're absolutely back on track now. We're working really closely with her and with colleagues and heads of service to really track and push those situations where we're finding that we've got some blocks, and we're regularly having conversations and seeing things moving forward for children and families. So we'll keep pushing from our side, and I'm confident that through those working relationships we can get to a space that we need to be.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for an interesting and very readable report. Over the years, we've learned, haven't we, in Leicestershire, that we've got to listen to the children are the important people. So can I take you to page 145 at the bottom and 146? And we're talking about statutory reviews, or you're talking about statutory reviews. A number of children and young people spoken to describe them as too adult-orientated. And you say you're going to do something about it. Can you describe what you're going to do about it in layperson's language, please?
Okay. I think we need to see the comment in the context in which it happened and in terms of how representative. When we're talking about our children in care, we've got currently over 500, and the children that contributed to some of the discussions may not necessarily have been given as wide a feedback and a balanced feedback as if we'd had a bigger number of children that had been consulted as part of our Ofsted inspection. That said, I absolutely get and understand that there are meetings that aren't very adult focused and are not sufficiently child focused. So what we've started to do is do some work through our Children in Care Council and through the Children in Care Council executive groups so that they can start amongst themselves but also to communicate with our wider cohort of children in care and get a better sense of understanding about how best they can participate, how best their meetings can be constructed in order to help them feel like they're more child-focused and they're less adult-orientated. We currently now have an approach in a number of situations where we'll split meetings, where we do listen to children, and children are saying very clearly to us, we don't want X person there, we don't want our parents there. So we manage those meetings in different sessions so that we get the contribution from all the key people, but we're actually doing it in a way that meets those children's needs and is listening to what they say. So we will continue to do more of that, and we'll continue to listen to what children are saying to us through our consultation methods to take on board their ideas and their suggestions about how we can do this better.
Thank you. Just a quick question from me in terms of the challenges that you outline on 137 and 138. Your bullet points 1, 2 and 8. Can you just quickly indicate to me that something about those challenges and what you're actually doing about them?
Sorry, I forgot the microphone. Point 8, I'm tempted to answer that question in terms of, in response to Mrs. Richardson's question. So I don't. I would, if you'd like more clarification and more detail, then I'm happy to do that.
No, if you feel that's being covered, then that's fine.
Okay. In terms of points 1 and 2, I think there's some key things that have come out of those challenges and representation of those themes that have been picked up by the IRO service. And on the back of point 1, we've had a whole-scale review of all our children in care that are subject to Section 20 agreements for their care. We've done that through oversight of the Permanence Panel, and we have that happening on a rolling basis. It's a feature that we do on a monthly basis. So after children have been in care for a period of 4 months, which is when we would expect to see a permanence plan, that's the statutory requirement, then if we still have children at that stage that we have subject to Section 20 arrangements, we have a deeper look into those situations and we ask managers and workers to come and explain to the Permanence Panel what the plan for that child is, what the strategy is, and we also ask them to work closely with legal services in terms of advice about the suitability of the Section 20 legal status. So I'm confident that we've got a really thorough system in place across the department now, and I feel much more confident about we know our cohort of children subject to Section 20. In terms of the special guardianship, again, that's a piece of work that's being driven under the umbrella of the Permanence Panel, and our new head of service, who's recently started, has taken that on board from her predecessor. There's a task and finish group that's been set up to look at the governance structure for special guardianship so that we can apply the same sort of criteria and assurance about that planning for children and young people as we do for other plans for example, adoption and fostering.
So a formal process is going to be put into place, but time frame on that, do we know?
I'm advised by my colleague Nikki that it's January time.
Lovely, thank you very much. Any other questions on this item before we move on? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Judith. Moving on to item 12, Leicestershire Fostering and Adoption Service Statutory Quality Assurance and Performance Reports. Pages 177 to 216 of your agenda pack. Paul, do you want to present the report, please? I think with the help of Nikki.
Chair, as with the last report, I'll just set the scene quite quickly and then Nikki will get into the detail. So again, this is a report that we present on an annual basis to the committee. These are both areas of our service which are very important in terms of the in-house fostering service and how we operate that, and also our adoption service and how we operate that. I'll point again to Ofsted report, as we do on a lot of these occasions. Both of these areas weren't seen to be in the greatest light at that point in time. We've a massive investment programme in terms of our in-house fostering service to grow that significantly over the next few years, which is starting to work well. And in relation to adoption, again, there was some negative comments in the Ofsted report about that. And in referring to the investment streams that we touched on earlier, you will see there were elements of investment in both of these services identified in those streams in terms of addressing some of the issues that were raised by Ofsted. So I'll stop there and allow Nikki to go on and get into the detail of the report.
Just take this opportunity to introduce my colleague Joss Longman, who is the Service Manager for the Fostering and Adoption Service, and is joining me today in case there's any questions you have directly of her. In relation to adoption, generally the adoption service performs very well, and those performance measures which we actually report regionally are on page 182 and 183 and are summarised for you. In relation to where we do very well, our timescales in relation to children are good. Making permanent decisions for children are good. In relation to our assessment quality of adopters, Ofsted found our assessment quality to be good. And in relation to our matching provisions, so that's matching a child's needs and profile and interest to an adoptive family, Ofsted found that our provision was good. In relation to the two areas where they found where they had difficulty, the one line of inquiry was in relation to why we had suspended our recruitment of adopters during the last financial year. We had made that decision because of the way in which the courts were making decisions for children, and that there had been a decline in the number of adoption orders or care plans made for children over this in the previous years. Ofsted found that they could find no evidence that our decision last year to suspend adoption recruitment had actually impacted on our ability to match or find homes for our children, which was good. In the relation to adoption support, they found our service lacking. They found our adoption support plans too general, too generic, and that we were over-reliant on the adoption support fund rather than having local and internal provisions that we could rely on. So that is part of our recommendation and part of our investment that is required. We've already taken steps to address that provision. We've met with Quorum, which is a charity, and offer a range of provision to adopters, and we will start going live, introducing those over the next few months. We have a new worker in the team who will be offering what is we call a core offer of support, and makes contact post-placement, post the order being made, makes contact at regular points to make sure that the adopters remember their training. So, because what adopters tell us is because the training's front-loaded before they've had their child, or they've got their child with them, a lot of that training isn't absorbed, or they don't remember it, because a lot of that period is around their anxiety and wanting a child in their lives. So that adoption worker now goes out post-placement as part of our core offer to remind them of the training and when to use it and when it's that's relevant and what to expect from that child at different ages of their life. So we've done a whole range of things. Those are just a couple of examples to strengthen our adoption offer, and we'll continue to do so over the next few months. I've also been to, myself and my adoption colleagues have been to another local authority who's deemed outstanding in their adoption provision to look at ways in which they achieve that, and we have a whole range of measures that we'd like to introduce to Leicestershire. Some are quick wins, and some will require more thought about how we integrate those provisions or functions into our services. But on the whole, I feel like we deliver a good service, and that area that we're weak in, we've got clear actions to improve that provision.
Thank you. Do I have any questions from members? Mr. Kaufman.
Make a late start, but I'm interested in the future of our adoption service. It must be about 4 years ago when I first joined the council. There was this great plan by the government to regionalise us, and something that was good I thought was possibly going to be put at risk, and I know you've mentioned it on page 193. What's really going to happen? Has Brexit stopped it, or something like that? Is it a real thing that's going to happen, or can our staff relax and carry on the good work?
I think that may be a question for Mr. Old, if you'd like to field that, Mr. Old.
I'm more than happy to.
I was hoping I could get in first.
Yeah, tough. Basically, all that glitters is not gold, and the Minister lost his seat at the general election earlier this year. There's also been a complete failure by the chair of the National Adoption Agency to answer 3 questions that I put to him at a meeting of East Midlands lead members and directors of children's social care. The first was, if you separate adoption, what is the impact on safeguarding and on fostering? Because to me, safeguarding, fostering and adoption are part of the same continuum. Secondly, Paul, since he came, has been telling me that people think they're going to save money through this process and end up finding that they're actually paying out more, but the control has gone. So I have deliberately, with the agreement of the leader, not committed us to the regional adoption agency. I suppose at some point in the future we'll get a directive, and if we ignore that, then we'll be visited by people from Whitehall who know best in these matters but can't answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Old. Did you want to follow up, Mr. Meredith?
Yes, just to reinforce a little bit what Ivan said and add to it a little bit. Clearly, we're all interested in improving adoption, and any things that can be promoted, we're happy to look at it. But as Councillor Old has said, we've got to be confident that it's in the best interests of children from Leicestershire to take part in that exercise. So that means at the end of it, we're going to end up with a service which is more cost effective, i.e. it delivers a better outcome at at least equivalent or better cost for us in the service. We can't see any evidence at this stage whatsoever that is the case. In fact, when we've compared some of our costs that we deliver in our service to other authorities, they're significantly lower than other areas. So, yes, we recognise we need to make a small investment in the service, as we've done, but some of the difference in our costs with other authorities are massive. So we think we do operate a good, efficient service, and now that we've started to re-look for adoptive parents as well, and that's been hugely successful, I think. Nikki has, or Josh will have the details on that. But not only will that be of benefit for the children of Leicestershire, but it will also be of benefit for children from other authorities, with the potential for us to offer those placements to other authorities so that we can improve adoption generally across the region. Those authorities will have to pay us for that work, of course. We're not a charity in that sense, and our costs have to be met. So there will be an income for us in that sense. But I think in terms of a business model, as it was, to take things forward, As we stand at present, that sort of approach, rather than a more consortium approach, was probably where we stand. But we never say no, but it has to be on the basis that there is a strong, effective evidence base that this will be in the best interests of the children of Leicestershire if we go down that route.
Thank you. Just before other members come in, the adoption recruitment was suspended at some point. Can you explain why that was the case? And obviously in the report we've got here that a specific recruitment campaign is required in relation to adoption. Can you address some of those matters, please?
Yeah, it was suspended. Nikki touched on that in her presentation. It predates me, so as Nikki is saying, the view was at that point in time, because of some of the issues we were having with courts about their reluctance to actually allow adoptions to go through. This is a national situation, that there was a judgment made at that time to step that down. We've now reversed that, and as I say, there's a lot of activity going on. And I think we have Nikki can tell you the numbers that we've got going through the system at present.
Thank you, Nikki. Yes, go ahead.
Yep. So Paul's right, and just to give you an indication, just sort of a bit more depth of information, at the point we suspended recruitment of adopters, it's because we had significantly more adoptive families than we had children, and we felt it would be unethical, and we could easily match the children we had to the pool of adopters we had, and we felt it would be unethical to recruit more adopters and not be able to offer them a child and a family at that stage. And when we looked at how the courts are making decision that year, we couldn't see that trajectory was going to change in the near future, over the next few months. That has changed now, and this financial year we know the numbers that are coming through and the numbers that are likely to have adoption plans for the year. So after the first quarter we had 36 children who are likely to have adoption plans. We now have 46, and we estimate we'll be close to 60 by the end of the financial year of children who will require adoption plans. That's almost double of what we would have had in the financial year where we thought to where we did suspend recruitment. So our recruitment activity has commenced, and we have a strategy to address that with events and advertising. And in quarter two, just to give you an indication, again, in the month that we have events, we had 9 households in stage 1 assessment, and 19 households that went into stage 2 assessment for adoption in 1 month. So that is showing that our recruitment is going to be very successful and hopefully meet our target. We estimate that we need 70 adoptive families to be able to make a good match for our children, the children who have adoption plans in Leicestershire this year.
Thank you. And sorry to monopolise, you need the 70 new adopters will be needed. That's your figures. But in point 6, you're indicating that you had 73 potential adopters, households, attend 5 open evenings. Is it realistic to say that we are going to get 70 new adopters?
It's a very big target. So our the authority that I referred to that's deemed outstanding in their adoption, their target is 55 for the year, and they feel that is an ambitious target. So it is an ambitious target for us, but that's what we could have set a lower target, but then we feel that we won't be able to meet the good standards of matching that we'll require for children. So we're being ambitious in our target.
Thank you. Mr. Welsh?
Thank you, Chair. Joss, thanks for the report. A really good read. Fostering specialist schemes. The language appears to have changed a bit, so perhaps you can help me with it. Sort of a year or so ago, we were talking about level 6 carers being useful to the authority because we'd got some very expensive out-of-county kids in residential care, and we thought we could do it within county in a better environment. And from this report, it seems to be that we've got a lot of kids in specialist placements. I'm trying to understand if they are the ones we were talking about. And in the report on page 204, you talk about level 5 specialist placement. which I hadn't heard that phrase. I only heard this level 6. So a little bit of education, and also, is that still our route, a preferred route going forward?
Thank you. Yes, and Nikki, you're going to field that?
Well, I've not presented the executive summary yet on the fostering report. I'm happy for if you want Joss to answer that question first, and then I'll present the executive summary.
There is no wrong time. I tell you what, why doesn't Joss deal with that, and then we'll go on to the executive summary. Okay, right.
We do have a number of specialist foster care schemes. You're quite right. Last year we were looking at them in terms of kind of levels, level 5, level 6. What we want to do now is kind of move on from that, because it's around, I think that historically it's around, it's perceived around money, I think, and the higher the level, the higher the fee. And I think what we wanted to do was bring that back down to be very more child-focused and actually say, actually, we're going to have a number of specialist schemes. So we replaced the level 6 as was with a scheme called the one-to-one scheme, which is more about being very clear that that's a professional, it's got a job description, it's about a professional working relationship with the foster carer, and that it would be about one carer having the opportunity to work with the one child. So they still are high-cost placements. These are on children who are on step down from residential placements, so it's bringing them back into a family-based setting. It's time-limited, working with children that have got a higher level of need, but also these children are on their journey almost as a step down back into the community. So it's that piece of work that we're doing. And the level 5, as was in the report, is also in relation to parallel care, is what we call them, which is around young people who are just coming into care, that it's on the point of crisis, that they come in and work with foster carers who are skilled to work with parents for those children to then be reunified back at home.
Thank you. Mr. Kaufman, did you have any question? No? Okay. No, that's all right. Mrs. Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Going back to the adoption report that we're looking at. Can I see there was 10 adopters that were approved in this period, and they were all white British. And then also as of 31st of March 2017, we have various amounts of people in stage 1 and stage 2 of the assessment. Are we encouraging adopters from other ethnic groups, and do we actually have a need in Leicestershire for adopters from other ethnic groups, and what we're doing to try to encourage that, please?
We do have a need. Proportionately, it is a very small need. Quite typically, our non-white cohort that we need in terms of adopters are for dual heritage children, and that's our predominant need. We have 3 areas of high need. It's not just ethnicity, so small groups of children but difficult to place. Ethnicity is one of them. Older children is another, and sibling groups included in that. So older children where there's a part of a sibling group. And then the third category is children with a disability, are harder to place. So our strategy for this year includes campaigns around those specific areas. So yes, we do need them, and we do have a plan to recruit specifically for those areas.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Can I just come back on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, have we had adopters within those difficult groups before? Has it been an ongoing problem for many years that we've not managed to solve yet?
Do you want to answer?
No, we have had recruitment. Obviously, the levels are pro rata in relation to that have been lower, but no, we do have carers from various backgrounds, and continue to be able to recruit to them.
Any further issues, questions from members? No? All right, Nikki, do you want to go on then to your further executive summary on fostering?
So the fostering report is a very broad report that that covers areas that are related to both recruitment and retention, and as I know you've read the report, I suppose the point that I'd like to make to you is that one without the other is futile. And what we learned from our carers, what we have learned and continue to learn from our carers over the last couple of years, that has been reinforced by the consultant who's been working with us, who's been able to give us some really good advice, is that although money is important to some carers, your support offer is absolutely critical, and you need to be able to sell yourself on the support offer. And what I've learned from the consultant is that our support offer, in many respects, not all respects, is much better than what our independent fostering agencies can deliver, because we have resources like a virtual school and their expertise. We have really good close working relations with our CAMS partners, and I spoke earlier on about the consultation hubs that they deliver on our behalf. We were able to implement that very smoothly. But what the consultant is saying is it's not that you don't deliver it, is that you don't sing and dance about it. You don't sell it. You don't sell yourself. You don't have the kinds of provisions and websites and opportunities to put it out into the market so that foster carers can see what your unique selling points are and why you need to work, why they should prefer to work with Leicestershire. So our drive in our campaign over this next year is going to be selling ourselves and having the platforms to be able to sell ourselves. That's not to say that our recruitment and the strategy that we had last year was ineffective. We are seeing the fruits of that now. So we broke even, for the lack of a better word, at the end of the last financial year with 119 carers. So we recruited as many as we lost through retirement and other factors. But we need to break above that. And this year's indication, the numbers coming through, show us that our recruitment strategy from last year that we implemented is going to be successful. We will meet our targets, but I believe that with the advice of the consultant, that in the upcoming months, as we implement that advice, we'll be even more successful.
Thank you. Just in terms of your report indicates that there were 704 expressions of interest in becoming foster carers. All of those expressions of interest from Leicestershire to start with, and that really translates then into only 22 new carers. Is that right?
That's correct. There's 2 points I want to make. Our standards for welcoming carers to Leicestershire are quite high, and they should be quite high. And quite often when families think about fostering, they've not thought about the nitty-gritty of what that would mean for their lives. So they might have full-time jobs, and when we actually talk to them, they've not thought about how they're going to manage their child's needs in the morning. They've not thought about what happens when the school phones to say that child's not settled and they've got to leave work, and they've not worked through a lot of those issues. The other point I would like to make is that actually we didn't have the kinds of consistent standards that we needed in the very beginning in relation to that next step into assessment, so from inquiry into assessment. So Joss did a lot of work around those standards, looking at nationally and what those benchmarks were, and have implemented those last year. And since those standards were implemented, we've seen a change in the numbers going from inquiry to initial assessment.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you. Foster carers, we're in the market competing with the private agencies who seem to turn this into an industry and seem to make a lot of money out of this. Now, I know you say that you've just said that it's the support that we give is the final thing that encourages people to come over. What do we pay in relation to the local private agencies paying? Because one thing that I know there are a lot of families that do it because they really want to do it, but I have seen instances where people have given up jobs to turn it into a, how can I describe it, into a business, which surprised me as a new member. It was like running a children's home, but the difference being that there wasn't a shift of staff. So you had the consistency of the same people there, and I just wondered what the market was like these days and how we're competing.
Nikki, do you want to address that?
So we we pay about the average cost, because our different carers get different payments for skill level and the complexity of the child, but our average cost is about $450 a week. Our lowest paying IFA, our cheapest IFA on our framework is £780 a week for the child, and our most expensive is £980. We do have instances, which is quite right, where the child's needs are so extreme that we have to pay for solo beds, which means we might be paying for 2 beds for one child, but those are quite exceptional, and quite often the work that the independent fostering agency does with that child will then actually reduce the needs, and then it frees up a bed again. So they're quite exceptional circumstances, but the IFA market ranges from about £780 to about £990 £990 per week per child. So a difference, quite a big difference, but we are finding that a number of our foster carers who are assessing now, and Josh will be able to provide more information, are approaching Leicestershire because they've heard of our support offer and aren't getting the level of support they were promised from our IFAs. I don't know if you want to add a bit more, Josh.
Just to pick up the point around running a children's home, is in terms of a foster care, I mean, that is why when, just to say that all foster carers are approved only to take up to 3 children, and if they take more than that, there has to be an exemption in place. That is to make sure, really, that it's not running as a children's home without the staff, as you quite rightly raised. Our foster carers, we've had a number of foster carers who work within the private organisations that are coming forward now to transfer to Leicestershire because of the support that we offer. We have a very individualised training programme for our foster carers. We provide training both online, and we provide training that is in the evenings and weekends, because we recognise that some carers aren't around in the day to take that up. We have a dedicated placement support team which was established in June of last year, and that is around supporting placement stability. So they have a group of workers that if there is a foster placement that's experiencing a particular difficulty, they will go out both to work with both the foster carer and with the children in the placement to actually resolve those issues and to offer behaviour management, therapy, and to embed those relationships down. We've got an out-of-hours support line, which our carers that use, which is basically they have access to a worker, and if there's been a particular difficulty, we have workers that will go out in evenings and weekends to support those placements. And they're on the phone at 11 o'clock offering support to foster carers dealing with particularly challenging young people.
Thank you. Any follow-up questions from members? Mr. Meredith.
Just to add a few points that Nikki and Joss have done about the service. I think this development of this service is very, very important for us over the next few years. As the report indicates, last year the service more or less stood still, but in that period of time we actually placed, I think it was about 30 to 40 additional children. I can find out the exact figure for members if required. So what we did over the period, although we didn't increase the number of foster carers, we were actually able to put extra children in there by maximising the resource that we had, which is a good thing. But we now got this plan to develop the service further in future years. The service here is small, probably too small from what you'd expect of an authority of this size. Thank you for that applause. I didn't realise that statement was so profound. So, if you to give you an example of the service.
Hold on one second. Mrs. Page, I think you might as well step outside. Yes. Mr. Meredith, please continue.
So, to give you an example, we visited a local, a neighbouring authority to us recently. Their fostering service is almost twice as big as our fostering service, and the authority is more or less the same size as us. And the figures that Nikki quoted you can see what financial pressures that this is causing us as a department, and in Cabinet next week you'll see there's a report in the medium-term financial strategy identifying some of the pressures that we're facing in the department at present. So I think that's a good example in terms of every time we place a child in a what we call an IFA placement, independent fostering agency placement, that costs us significantly additional sums of money, and we feel confident that it's perfectly possible for us to deliver a service in-house that can meet all the needs of young people equally well as independent fostering agencies, and in some situations I would argue better than some of the independent agencies. So the support offer is important for us in terms of recruiting. I think we've had a huge upswing in the last 6 months in terms of approaches and on the recruitment side, which is incredibly positive for us. We need to continue to build on that, and we're looking at all avenues that we can pursue to actually maintain that over the next few years, which could involve, I'm not saying definitely, but we are reviewing payments because we need to make sure that we're competitive across the piece, support plus payments. Just a quick final comment on the state of the market generally at present is that it's increasingly difficult to find placements, any form of placements, for children. And we struggle. Often we can go to IFAs for placements, and we know that some of those agencies have got 80, 90, 100 requests for every single placement that they have. So this is a national almost crisis that's emerging. The MJ, the Municipal Journal, had as a headline recently, Children's Social Care is broken, and referenced some of the pressures and issues that's in the whole system. And that's why it's more important still that we develop our own service to provide our own solution wherever we can to this crisis that's affecting the sector at present. And Nikki referenced a consultant. This is a person who's working with us to look at our business plan and refine our business plan for the next few years to make sure that we've got everything in there that will give us the maximum opportunity over the forthcoming years to really expand and develop our services, our in-house fostering service. So it is a key, essential element for us over the next few years.
Thank you. I presume that the consultant will be coming up with a report at some point in time, and then that will indeed come to scrutiny. Is that right?
By all means, you can ask to see a copy of that report when that's complete.
Thank you. Any other questions or issues raised? Yes, Mrs. Seaton.
I hesitate to use this forum as a piece of a learning curve for me, but I've just realised again how ignorant I am about several things. One, I didn't realise there was private fostering agencies. So I suppose why would I if I've never been gone down that road? So my first question would be, well, who pays them? If we have a fee, who pays the higher fee that's offered by then? And a piece of information I had received about 6 months ago was about adoption, and I thought you adopted and that was that. But I understand an adopted child also has a fee paid to the adoptive parents. So I want to know whether, because my face was like that when I was told, because I just didn't think that was the case. So I'd just like some clarity on that, please. Thank you.
Yes, Paul, if you could briefly answer those questions, please.
Yeah, I'll briefly answer, but what I could say is that we're always welcome if you want to come into the department and speak to the managers, and we can get into a lot more detail than probably we could do as part of this. So we're always happy to to have you welcome you into the department. So get in touch with myself or the officers, and we'll make time for you to come in. The simple answer is we pay the independent agencies. Yes, you can pay allowances to adoptive parents, and that's one of the areas that Ofsted criticised us on, that our support packages for some adoptive parents were not perhaps as robust, as strong as they should be. Now, the reason that we pay that is that what we want to do these days is to extend adoption as an offer to children who probably wouldn't have been adopted before. So some of those may be children with disabilities or with challenging behaviour. Some of them may have been from parents who maybe drank or smoked during pregnancy, so there may be risk of emerging emotional health and well-being issues as young people grow because of alcohol consumptions during pregnancy. So what we do is that we assess the needs of the children and to encourage the adoption, say that we will provide support in these specific areas to make sure that you can adopt. So that's the reason we do it. We don't frivolously give out money to encourage the adoptive. It's got to be linked to the needs of the child in each situation. So some adoptive parents will have no support. They might just say, we want to go our own way, and that's it. Other ones, to allow them to support children that, even as small babies, might not be showing any challenging behaviour. As they grow, they may develop more challenging behaviour, so that we want to provide additional support at that time to allow the placement to continue. So that's why. But please come into the department, talk to us, and we can go into a lot more detail.
Thank you, Paul. Any other issues or questions on this particular item? No? All right. Well, then we're to the dates of our future meetings. They're set out in your agenda. The next one is the 13th of November, 1:30. Any other items? I have no other urgent items. So I thank you all for your attendance here today. Thank you.